Hi, everybody. Welcome to another episode of Modern Business Operations, the top-ranked podcast in business operations and legal operations. I'm your host, Briana Okyere, and today I am joined by Steve Hufford, Senior Managing Director and COO at Raymond James Investment Banking. Hi, Steve. How you doing?
Hello, Briana. Nice to see you as well. Glad to be here today. Thank you.
Yeah, I'm excited to have you. I've actually really been looking forward to this conversation because when you and I did our preliminary prep call before this, you had so many good sort of candid tidbits for me. And, we chatted for the whole time and I was like, I wish I could just record this because it would have made an excellent podcast. So we're going to refine that conversation a little bit more for all of you. And Steve just has an awesome career, so many great insights. So I'm really excited to have you here.
Well, thank you. I was super excited too until you and I had a couple of technical difficulties in the heart rate up really high. So hopefully we do as well as we did in the prep call.
Yeah, we'll get that mood back. That's just
good.
That's just how these things go, Steve has a ton of experience, which we'll get into in a second, in being a people manager. And he's going to talk about what that means and share some practical insights for all of you who are looking to become managers, are looking to advance in your careers, or simply looking for better ways to work. But before we get into all that, Steve, if you wouldn't mind just sharing a bit about sort of how you got into your current role, what was your first role in ops, or how did you get into this field in general?
Right. And thank you for that, Briana. And again, I'm super glad to be here with you guys today. Hopefully it'll, yield some value to folks. So career-wise, I've had a pretty indirect, maybe kind of wandering career. I don't have a very, super distinct straight line career path. I graduated from law school at the University of Virginia in 1985. I took a very traditional approach. I went into the law business at a law firm. I was a mergers and acquisitions lawyer, and I, went through the traditional path. I was an associate, a senior associate, ultimately a partner. And in that career path, I was managing transactions for corporate clients for the most part, to a large degree merger and acquisition types of transactions, and some degree IPOs. And I developed a bit of a specialty around technology transactions, and in particular, financial technology was an area that I spent a lot of time in. This is back in the 90s, before fintech was really a thing. You were sort of representing banks and helping them initiate different kinds of technology transactions that they were doing back then. So that was sort of career version number one. The internet came along in the mid 90s, kicked up a lot of dust. There was a lot of opportunity. A former mentor of mine in the legal business convinced me to join him in a corporate development role that morphed over a little bit of time into an entrepreneurial role. So for the next 8 to 9 years of my career after my legal career, I was, an operator, kind of like the second chair in an entrepreneurial operation. We were building small companies, often around the financial technology arena, and building them up. I was leading the sales efforts around that, helping to raise capital, helping kind of manage the technology operations. And then ultimately we sold both of those businesses. So I had kind of a 8 or 9 year career in an entrepreneurial mode. Took a little bit of time off after that. Was recruited by Raymond James to build a financial technology investment banking practice at the firm that I'm at right now. I did that starting in 2008, right about the time of the great financial crisis, which was an interesting time to enter the business from that perspective. Did that for several years. And then in late 2017, I was asked by my current boss and the guy who had been my partner in the development of that fintech practice to join him in helping to manage the investment. He at that time was the head of investment banking. He now carries the title of president of global equities and investment banking, and I am his chief operating officer for purposes of helping to manage the investment bank. So really kind of 4 careers where I've sort of migrated from as you know, being a doer of deals, to being an organizer of deals, to being kind of a manager of deals, to being a manager of people who do deals. So maybe a natural migration, but that's kind of been the path.
I'm curious, are you allowed to talk about any of the IPOs that you managed?
I probably can't today. Gosh, it's been a long time. I'm thinking back a long ways, but one that was actually probably kind of interesting because I was right in the middle of it was Earthlink back in the early internet days. Earthlink, of course, was one of the early internet service providers, and I was fortunate to be part of the team that took that one public and then made a number of different transactions along the way. It eventually wound up merging with a similar company called MindSpring here in Atlanta and sort of birthed itself that way. But yeah, that was a fun one because we got into our involvement with Earthlink probably in 94, 95, which would have been right about where the internet was sort of blossoming. And then we rode it for quite a ways till it was a public company, and then took a big investment from Sprint, and then ultimately did that MindSpring deal. So that was a fun one.
Nice. I love hearing about the early days of the internet. I won't share how old I was when that IPO happened, but I was just out of diapers.
That could be embarrassing for me. I will tell you this is a funny digression. I won't use too much time up on this, but I remember my first time on the internet was literally in the lobby of Earthlink's office in Pasadena, California. They had a computer terminal set up and you could get on and go on the internet. So I did right there. And it was like, wow, this is interesting. Up to that would have been 94 maybe. So wow. I'm dating myself pretty badly now. I realize that.
You're also a part of history. That's a good
ancient. Yeah.
I love it. Okay, so I want to talk about your management and your time as a manager and sort of the lessons you learned. So management is a topic that's covered a lot. When I ask people to come on the show, they usually say, I'm happy to talk about culture, management, et cetera. And a lot of the times I say no because it's sort of an oversaturated topic. But in this case, I think some of the things that you were willing to share made me really interested to talk about this topic with you specifically. And there's also a reason that people chat about management so much. It's because people are often promoted into management positions because they're great individual contributors, right? But being an individual contributor has nothing to do with being a manager at the end of the day. And so what are some of the best management lessons you've learned that other people who maybe are great IC that are looking to get promoted or are recently promoted individual contributor that sort of want to learn some of these skills?
Yeah, so this was an interesting question and got me thinking a lot about, okay, how did I land here? Like, how did that happen? And I'll start by saying I don't have any formal management training, right? I went to law school. I don't have an MBA. I didn't, fast track in some management program at a bank or telecom company. I know they have a lot of those fast track programs. I never did any of that. I was always, as you say, an individual contributor. Now, I did wind up over time running decent sized teams to manage M&A transactions typically. So I had experience, interacting with people at large scale and guiding them and giving direction and that sort of thing. But again, I have really literally zero formal management training. And I thought a little bit about, okay, how did I get here? And I'd say a couple things, and then I'll kind of go through what some of the management lessons that I've derived are, or at least maybe a process that I think about when I'm making a decision. But one of the things that I think has been really important for me in terms of growing into my role is the effect that mentors have had on me over the years. One of my early mentors, I remember telling me, this is, again, a long ways back. This would have been way back in the 80s when I was, kind of a brand new associate at a law firm, mentioned to me that one thing that is just productive to do is to be super observant of the people around you and think about what they do really well and what they don't do really well, and kind of use every experience you have professionally is a learning experience, either positively or negatively. And I remember taking that to heart very early on. And I think I've been a pretty careful observer of the people around me, ever since then. And in that guise, I've learned a lot just by watching what other people do. And I've also had the good fortune of having had at least 3 really good mentors in my career. We'll talk about that separately if you want. But that's led me to kind of a series of observations maybe that I'd lay out for you about how I go about making decisions. And maybe one more little predicate here. A lot of what I do has to do at some level with resource allocation. Team A wants to use these resources and team B wants to use them. Who gets them? That's probably the simplest articulation of it. But I'm sort of a judge or a resource allocator or an arbitrator, if you will, between competing claims on a scarce set of resources. So that's a lot of the paradigm I work in. Not the only one, but that's kind of a common one. And so I thought a lot about, how do you make good decisions, when you've got 2 parties there and one's going to win, one's going to lose, and you're the bad guy who has to decide at the end of the day. You've got to manage it by making a decision. I'd say a few things. Like I thought about a series of rules that are kind of a progression for how I think about that. The first one is to come prepared and really do the legwork to know what all the arguments on side A and side B are. I never want to be sitting in front of the participants in this debate, because a lot of times, we'll all be on a call together. We might all be in a meeting together. And I don't want to be in that meeting and be surprised by a fact that I have not encountered, that I had not thought about prior to that meeting. I want to make sure I go in with as complete as I can get, kind of understanding of what the facts are. Secondly, I want to be transparent and honest with all parties. I find that in a management role, it never helps to, marginalize the truth or play the margins of honesty. Now, that doesn't mean that I'm going to spill the beans and tell you everything that I know about the backdrop for a certain decision. Like, there's some things that the participants in the decision are not entitled to know, but I'm going to be super honest and transparent with them about the decision-making factors that lead me to conclude a certain way rather than another way. And I think even when people lose that decision, when they're not the prevailing party in that decision, they appreciate the fact that you've been completely transparent with them about how you thought about it. They may not agree, but they can appreciate the transparency. The third thing I would say, Briana, is I try to be decisive. Like, I don't want to hem and haw and allow a decision to draw out far longer than it needs to. At some point, we just need to make a call and move on. Again, it may not make everyone happy, but you've got to make a decision. The fourth rule will sound possibly contradictory with the third rule, but I don't think it is. And that is, this is one that the fellow I work for today is really good at, and that is what I'll call finding the third way. And what I mean by that is when you have 2 participants in front of you competing for the same set of resources, there's A's view and there's B's view, and A and B are assuming that you're going to pick A or pick B. And something I've learned, again, from the guy I work for today is, look for the third way. Look for the synergy between A and B that lead to C and give you a better outcome. And as I've worked with him over a long period of time, I've come to realize that in most situations, there is a third way. It's just that people are not really thinking about it or gravitating towards it when the decision starts, or, when the topic starts. So I think that's an interesting point. You can still be decisive and find the third way. They're not really trade-offs with each other. And then the last thing I would say is follow up on the decision. People really appreciate when, let's say I didn't find the third way and I went with A instead of B. Following up with B 2 weeks later to say, hey, how's it going? I know that decision didn't come out the way that you were hoping it would, but I'm interested to see, if the experience is different from what you thought it might be. And that's, by the way, that's particularly useful when you found the third way, is to follow up and say, hey, we looked at it in a different way when we came to a decision. How is that working for you now? And again, that sense that you care and that you're willing to follow up, and you didn't just make a decision and you left it and the pieces are on the floor and it's up to you all to pick it up and figure it out. I think people appreciate that as well. So maybe one overarching principle, and then I'll pause and let you ask another question, is just the importance of being relational with people in a role like this, particularly professional people. Investment banking is populated by very talented, very driven people who are, very career-centric in the way they think about the world. Conveying to them that you care about the decisions that were made and you're willing to follow up on them and alter the course if need be. Sometimes you hear, Steve's really working poorly. Can we come back together and think about doing it maybe slightly differently again? Being open to do that, I think, is important in certain circumstances as well.
I love this. I've been taking notes while you've been chatting. I've got be observant, collect mentors, watch resource allocation, be prepared, be transparent, be decisive, find the third way. And when you do, follow up, and then finally be relational. Yeah,
good. I didn't think of it quite in that list, but that's a good list. I think that works in a lot of different settings.
Yeah. It works even, I'm an IC and it works for me in many ways. I'm pulling stuff from this as well. So that's super helpful. A lot of our audience is comprised of folks across all industries, but we skew a little technical, like automation focused. You've worked in sort of more established industries over the course of your career. So what lessons would you share with like younger, newer companies with less management experience or size overall? Just like smaller orgs.
So sort of the more entrepreneurial versions. Yeah. And again, I had a stint where I worked in an entrepreneurial environment for a while, so I'm at least familiar with it. That I thought that was a really interesting question. And by the way, in our investment banking practice, we work with a lot of great entrepreneurs and entrepreneurial businesses. So, it's a relevant question for us too, even though, we are more of an established organization. I'd say the thing that I thought about when I was thinking about those entrepreneurial companies and the ones I worked in and the ones we serve is that they're usually characterized by a high degree of passion that inevitably comes from the founder. The founder has a vision. He or she has a baby. That's the baby. There's a lot of things that are great about the baby, and a great founder is really good at bringing people to his or her vision and causing folks to get excited about it and, kind of run in that direction. So most of these entrepreneurial organizations, I think, are really characterized by a high degree of passion. This was true in a couple of the organizations that I worked in, so maybe that's why it resonated for me. But to me, the lesson in that, or the flip side of that's worth noting, is the value of discipline and steady plodding. Like a lot of times, passion leads to a lot of energy, but also a lot of movement and tacking with the wind and going some different directions. One of the other kind of long-term lessons of my career is just the value of patience and steady plodding and not giving up on something too quickly, sticking with it. You can use an exercise analogy, right? The first day of exercise, doesn't do you a whole lot of good, but the 30th day of exercise really has a lot of value because of the cumulative effect of those deposits over time. I think that's really true. And I think, in my own personal experience, early stage starting to be really high on the passion, but not place enough value on the discipline associated with just steady plodding and continued deposits. So that was kind of one of the things. And that, by the way, I think is a value that someone in sort of a COO-ish type of a role can bring to it is to be a bit of a counterbalance to that entrepreneurial enthusiasm and remind the organization of the value of, sticking with the program and making those deposits day in and day out.
I love that analogy. It's like a startup is doing like 2 hours of insanely intense cardio once a week, but the CEO comes in and says, actually, let's do 45 minutes a day.
Right. Exactly. I mean, steady deposits kind of works in, I'm going to say, almost every area of life.
Yeah.
But it is a discipline, and, we're all disciplined to one degree or another and in different ways. When I find myself wheel spinning, I often think, okay, I should just get back to the discipline of making the steady deposits day after day and trying to see where this thing goes over a longer period of time, as opposed to, frenetic wheel spinning in the moment.
Yeah, 100%. So I'm going to continue asking Steve questions and chatting with him, but we do have a live audience listening in. So if any of you in the live audience have questions for Steve, please feel free to start jotting them down now in the chat in Bevy, and we'll address them as they come in. So I want to talk also about sort of like the progression of this. So, a smaller org probably won't have a COO. Larger org probably will. So when should someone bring in a COO, at what stage, and what is why would they do that, and what does that look like?
That's a good question, and one of the more challenging, Briana, of the ones you had on your map, in part because I think it depends a lot contextually, not conceptually, but contextually, as to where the company is. But if I kind of went back to some of the other things I said earlier, I think I think COOs kind of emerge role-wise, if I can say it that way, probably kind of for two reasons, I think. One is the organization has gotten big enough and complex enough, not that it's huge, but it has grown enough that it has resource allocation issues, right? You're running into, we can either code this project or we can code that project, but we can't code both projects. And so someone needs to sit in the middle of that and kind of arbitrate that. Obviously, in a technology organization, a product on that, and the management team's going to have influence on that. But, getting to a place where someone is a decision maker around how should these scarce resources be used, usually I think means that someone operating somewhat like a COO, you don't have to call them that, but someone who's performing that kind of a function becomes necessary. The other aspect of a COO, again, it's a generic term and it has a lot of different connotations, I think. So what I'm about to say may not be true kind of in every instance. But I think in a lot of cases, the COO has to have a very trusting and trustful relationship with I'll call it the CEO, because the COO really operates as the CEO's emissary to the rest of the organization, and in a lot of instances outside of the organization. And so there's got to be a lot of trust there, an ability to for the COO not to necessarily go beyond, the scope of what the CEO might endorse. In the role that I have here, I just have to always realize I'm sort of speaking not just on my own sometimes. So I need to be cautious about that to preserve that trust relationship. And I think, these kinds of CEO-COO relationships really work best when that trust exists and both parties know what to expect from the other one. And, there's just a kind of a natural seamlessness to, oh, I got this issue, let me go take it for you and spare you the burden of that sort of thing.
100%. Thank you for answering that question. I was really curious about that. So, and then moving into the future, what do you think the COO title looks like in the future state? unsure times, recession, et cetera. Seems like a really vital role right now. So what do you think the future looks like for the position?
And again, another interesting question. I'm not a great sort of futurologist, so I'll give it my own kind of best effort, if you will. Look, I think it's the kind of role that, again, where you have a sense of competing resources across a firm, a person who is trusted by the CEO and trusted, frankly, by the organization as well to make wise decisions. And again, it may not be decisions that everyone likes, but they believe that you're thoughtful about it and you're discerning and you're transparent, all of those things we talked about earlier. I think that means there's sort of always a place for that, whether it's called COO or something else. I would agree with you that one of the things that, if I look long term in my career, like I started in the work world back in 1985, and here it is 2023, and I'm still hacking away at it every day. One of the things I've learned about the business world and the financial world in that time frame is that there seems to be greater and greater volatility in the world. Like it used to be that these kind of volatile downturns would happen, every 10 years, and then it seemed like every 8 years, and it just seems to accelerate. And the volatility, the distance between the top and the bottom of the swing seems to grow greater with each one of these. I think that's a reflection of kind of the growing complexity and interconnectedness of the world. And the times we live in are pretty volatile, 2023 feels a lot different to me than 1993 felt across a whole range of a whole number of dimensions. So I do think that, what's implicit in your question, Briana, is, are we living in a more volatile world, and does the COO role become more or less important in a volatile world? I think it probably becomes more important, just because a good COO, I think, is a bit of a ballast for the organization, kind of a centering point between, this vision and that vision. Hopefully a good COO is sort of a discerning individual who can build consensus around something that will work for a lot of people, as opposed to something that leans, heavily in one direction or another. So I think the position, remains valid, remains legit for a long time to come. My gut is it probably is more important as sort of a tethering vehicle. My other working hypothesis would be that the volatility that we see out there in the world probably isn't going away anytime soon. You can kind of see that in the news every night, right? Something else is happening that's throwing the world, a curveball that we've now got to cope with in a new way.
100%. Yeah. And I do think the COO role will continue to be and will become more important. So we're running short on time, but we do have 2 questions from our live audience.
Okay.
One from Aurelian. He wants to know, with the hype around ChatGPT, what is your take on how AI could potentially transform the COO role?
Terrible new tech, futurologist kind of a guy. That is a hard question for me. I've played around with it a little bit. It is kind of amazing. There's a sense in which it's reading your mind and writing something better than you can write it. And so I think when a new technology comes out and does that, it's sort of stunning for everyone, which is, I think, the reaction that we've all collectively had. Lots of people have thought more deeply about it than I have. My overriding reaction to the whole thing is maybe a little bit counterintuitive, or maybe a bit old school, or maybe just reflects the fact that I'm an old guy and that's the way I prefer to think about it. But the way I think about it is it's an interesting technology. I'm sure it has lots of applications for maybe some of the more rote tasks that get done in the business world day after day. But my gut also tells me that at least it'll be a long time before it sort of incorporates wisdom and discernment into an algorithm. That seems to be the thing that distinguishes human intelligence from machine intelligence. And so my gut is that there will be plenty of opportunity for smart, talented people to continue to serve in roles like this, not just this role, but there's a lot of different business opportunities that, that replace some work that's done in the workplace, but intelligent people who know how to exercise wisdom and discernment and judgment and be highly relational, those skills strike me as not going away anytime soon. And so it strikes me that the overall effect of it may be to replace some of the stuff that maybe machines can do, give the rest of us opportunity to dedicate our minds to higher order tasks that may lead to more interesting developments over time. Again,
I agree.
Somebody who's not a technologist by nature and hasn't done much more than just kind of play around with the application a little bit and be somewhat amazed by it. I will admit that.
Yeah, same. And it definitely helps with the rote tasks, 100%. So we have another question from our live audience from Bruno. What advice would you give an aspiring ops leader / COO? Great way to end it.
I would say, I'll try not to go too long. I would say back to the being observant, watching other people, being self-aware. And being self-aware, I cannot emphasize enough how important it is, I think, to managing people or to conducting yourself well in the workplace, to know the impact you're having on other people. I was once given a lesson, and the essence of the question that was asked in the lesson was to ask people what it feels like to be on the other side of you. It's a very provocative question. What does it feel like to be on the other side of me? It takes a lot of courage to ask people who work for you that question, because you could get a pretty raw answer back. But it's an interesting way of thinking about it, because if you're conscious of that, of maybe being willing to ask that question at some point, then it means you're super conscious about the effects you're having on other people. You've got a high degree of self-awareness. So I think building self-awareness in addition to being observant. And then the third thing I would say is, look for opportunities to both be mentored and to mentor. Now, that word gets kind of glorified maybe a little too much. People think about, I've got to have a mentor, I've got to have a designated person. I don't really think about it that way. I think of it more as an activity rather than a person, right? And the activity is the one of being trained up, in a skill of some sort. And I think for a lot of budding ops leaders and COOs, you want to maximize your learning opportunities by being observant of others and getting that mentoring in just kind of a natural way. And then I would emphasize that it's important not to just breathe it in, but to breathe it back out, meaning practice mentoring others. Again, it doesn't have to be, I'm your mentor and we're going to have coffee every Tuesday morning at 8:30. It doesn't need to be that. It more needs to be, I saw that once in my career. Let me give you 2 cents on how I would think about that. Just being in that mode. One of the things that we cultivate at Raymond James is something that we call a culture of mentoring, which is that everybody should be on the lookout to be helping somebody else out, or building in them a skill that I've already built in myself. Just if we're constantly looking for those opportunities, then we're creating a culture of mentoring. Becomes a really fun, interesting kind of learning place to work, and that's the environment that we'd like to create ultimately.
I think that that's great, and a great way to end it. And as a final question, how can people get in touch with you if they want to follow up after this? Sure.
Simple. It's, steve.hufford@raymondjames.com. Be patient with me. I sometimes have more email than I need, but I'll do my best to circle back to everybody.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Steve. It's been a pleasure chatting with you. As always, I really appreciate you taking the time, and I really appreciate your knowledge. So thank
Thank
you.
you. This was fun. Thanks, Briana.
Yeah. And thanks everyone for listening in. I'm your host, Briana Okyere. Make sure to join the Adaptive Ops community at operations.community to chat further with folks like Steve, et cetera. And have a great rest of your day, everyone.
Thank you. Bye, everybody.